All right. Uh, Welcome back again for another webinar from Wildlife for You. Today, we're going to be doing a brand new webinar, and it's going to be about a brand new topic. And you see on the screen here, excuse me, today's webinar is going to be the return of the bugle. And what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes to an hour is talk about this magnificent creature you see before you, and also talk about some of the restoration efforts for this animal, especially in the eastern half of the United States. Sorry about that. The presenters today it's going to be myself again. I'm Daryl Radijek. Many of you know me, but we also have Kim Delozier joining us again. Many of you have seen Kim's webinars or read his books. Kim joins me quite often regarding bear webinars, but he's also an elk specialist, and I've spent a good deal of my time talking about elk as well. So with that, I want to welcome everyone. I want you to sit back, relax, enjoy this webinar, and when the time comes, I want you to ask questions, whether or not it's me, Kim, or anyone else, because that's what we're here for. So for the next time being, just sit back, relax, and enjoy what we present, and then hopefully we'll carry on that discussion for as long as you want. So let me go to the next slide. And I always do this because I always think it's really important, especially for anyone that is joining us brand new, who's never seen a presentation from us before, from Wildlife for You before. We want to make sure that people understand that the wildlife professionals who are presenting this do have some really good experience. And so these are the two folks who will be presenting. I'm going to introduce myself, then I'll turn it over to Kim to introduce Kim. I know many of you guys know I have a lot of bear experience, but what you may not know is I was also the elk coordinator for the state of Tennessee for a while. We did have someone dedicated to elk, but I was the big game coordinator. And so as I served my time with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, I was responsible for the deer, the bear, and the elk programs and overseeing those programs. And so with that, I was able to partake in a number of different elk studies, and not just started those studies, but really worked on them over the course of time. And it's one of those things, again, not many people realize all the different different animals that I had to work with while I was at the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and elk actually were one of my main responsibilities. And so I did that for about 7 years. I was also, many of you know, I was promoted to the Chief of Wildlife for another 5 years after that. So I was overseeing quite a bit in the state of Tennessee, which is just the most unbelievable experience ever, and I'm truly blessed by that. And so I won't ramble on. Many of you know who I am, but I do have about 20 years experience. But I love bringing in some of these other folks that have a lot more experience, and I'm going to introduce Kim Delozier, and I'll let Kim give a little bit background information about himself.
Well, thank you, Daryl. It's good to be with you guys here tonight as well. But I actually started went to University of Tennessee in wildlife and fisheries science, and actually started working with Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1978. And I worked there really for my entire career. I had 32 plus years there working in wildlife management. I started out as a wild boar hunter for the government and worked in wildlife the entire time, and ended up on my last several years as the supervisory wildlife biologist for the park. Involved with bears, of course, hogs, all the big animals too, and reintroductions, peregrine falcon, river otter, red wolf, and lastly elk. So I retired about 8 years ago from the National Park Service, and now I'm the Eastern Program Manager for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Really, my main purpose in my position is to work on elk restoration throughout the eastern United States. I also teach classes for Safe Capture International. They teach classes on chemical immobilization of wildlife. So I've done that now for about 3 years. So all in all, most all of my life has been just really working with wild animals, and feel very blessed, appreciate it to have that opportunity.
All right. Thanks, Kim. All right. With that, since you now know who the instructors are, we're going to dive into this this presentation of Return of the Bugle. And I plan on leading the way for the first probably 15, 20 minutes as we talk about elk. Kim will be asked to join in, but then I'm going to turn over the last part of the presentation where we talk about our restoration efforts and let Kim kind of lead that discussion. And so let's begin with what animal are we talking about? And so it's pretty simple. This creature right here is going to be the topic of our discussion, and many of us just simply refer to this animal as elk. One of the things that I found was really interesting whenever I'm giving these talks is I do quite a bit of research to find out some interesting facts. And I didn't realize this, but one of the reasons this animal got the name elk is when Europeans first came to this continent and they saw them, they weren't exactly sure what they were, and they called them elk because back in Europe, elk is actually the term for moose. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on a couple of different slides. But this is the animal we're going to be talking about. You may have heard of it referred to as Wapiti or Wapiti. That is more of a Native American term for this creature. I particularly love that because I love some of the Native American terms that are used for it. But in the biological world, we're always going by the Latin names because this is something that we know for sure. When you use a Latin name, you know exactly what it is, no matter where in the world you are. And so Cervus canadensis, the genus is Cervus, the species is canadensis. Now there are a number of species, or there's a number of animals in this Cervus genus, but we're not going to talk about those. This North American elk goes by Cervus canadensis. The strange things with Latin names, though, and this is where it gets a little frustrating, sometimes they change us. They change on us. And so you got to try to stay up to date. But whenever we're referring to animals in the scientific world, we try to use that genus and species name just to make sure, yes, we're talking about the exact same animal. So this is going to be the topic of our discussion. And I'm going to jump right in here. And one of the things I love doing is I love showing people where you find these animals. And so we're going to be talking about elk and what is elk range. And so this slide I have here will show you what the elk range is in North America if you landed on the continent about 500 years ago. And so this is where elk were found all throughout North America way back in the 1500s. And then you'll understand from that point, as soon as Europeans came in, we started seeing lots of animal populations begin decreasing because we're exploiting these animals and really using up that resource faster than it could be renewed. So a lot of these populations decreased. But this is where elk historically ranged all over North America. And you see it covers most of the continent. You see a big gap in the far northern parts of Canada, as well as a couple of gaps in that Texas area and a little bit of that Nevada, Southern California area. But for the most part, you found elk everywhere else. And one of the things that I talked about in my previous webinar regarding bears was this concept of subspecies or different varieties. And so this is where elk historically ranged in North America. But oftentimes scientists kind of segment different geographic ranges and they call them subspecies or different varieties. And so, believe it or not, in North America, there were 6 subspecies of elk or geographic ranges of elk. So the very first subspecies there were, or the different variety, was the eastern elk. And that was located primarily east of the Mississippi River. Another geographic range were these elk that were found in the Southwest. These were actually called Merriam's elk. And so those were obviously 2 different species. I'll go through all of them. Another big species here is what is called the Manitoban elk. These are pretty much the elk found in the plains area. We also had the Rocky Mountain species or subspecies. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say species. Those obviously are found in the Rocky Mountains. Then you also have what are called Roosevelt elk. And this geographic range is found in that Pacific Northwest area. And then the last of these subspecies was called the Thule elk. And these are found in California. So I put this up there because people talk about these different subspecies. But if you look at all these pictures, guess what you're looking at, folks? You're looking at an elk. It's the exact same species all across there. All this subspecies talk is about different geographic range where they're found. And this is really important because one of the things that occurred, remember I told you as soon as Europeans came, we weren't really good at managing our resource, and we started wiping them out wherever we found them. And sadly, this eastern variety, these elk that inhabited the East Coast, those are now extinct. Those have been wiped out completely. In fact, the last one I think is 1877. I'm thinking it was killed up in Michigan. But that eastern subspecies was more or less completely wiped out. Same thing happened with the Merriam's elk, that southwestern subspecies. And so those two geographic ranges of elk were completely wiped out. And all that left is these four different subspecies. Now, again, remember, this is all the same animal we're talking about. We're just talking about the different geographic ranges they came from. So that is what kind of happened over time, the first couple hundred years of the United States existence. We're really bad at maintaining animals, and we wiped out elk from certain areas. Now, the good thing is, starting in 1900s, we've had some really wonderful people like Teddy Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold, some of these great pioneers in the world of wildlife that said, hey, wildlife is a fantastic resource. We have to conserve it. And so beginning in the 1900s, they started forming groups and started a movement to start protecting our wildlife resources. And so you see the beginning of some of these state wildlife agencies and these federal agencies that are dedicated solely for the preservation and conservation of wildlife. And because of that, we're starting to restore animals to where they once were, or at the very least, we're offering them protections so we don't wipe out any more of these species or subspecies. And so if you look at the geographic range right now, present day, if you look at that red area, obviously it's much, much smaller compared to what it was historically. But you can see the good thing is we're starting to spread out. You see the main concentration of elk are still in those western states, especially the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Northwest. But a lot of those western states have very, very, very healthy populations of elk. But what's so interesting and so wonderful to see is you see those red dots that are starting to appear on the eastern half of the United States, east of the Mississippi, or even in Arkansas and Missouri. You're starting to see elk populations return again. And this is what I'm going to have Kim talk a little bit about. But that's pretty much where we find most of the elk populations in North America. And I will tell everyone, I will warn everyone again, whenever you look at a range map, understand that it's dynamic. It moves around all the time. Things blink out, things appear. But the good thing is you're starting to see this return of elk to the eastern portion of the United States. That's because they were historically there, and we'd love to restore them again. So if you were to ask us how many elk are in North America, Kim and I were talking about this before the webinar started. It's very difficult to get a really good population estimate. And so these questions of how many animals are in North America, understand it is a wild guess. It's our best guess, but estimates put that whole North American elk herd, when you're looking at the four remaining subspecies, you combine all those, we're looking somewhere close to 1 million animals. It could be 800,000, could be over 1 million. We don't really know for sure, but there's still a fairly strong population of these animals in North America. So with that, let's talk a little bit about this animal itself. I'm going to get biological here, and I don't like doing that because I like keeping it easy to understand and don't want to get too technical or too nerdy. but elk come from the family Cervidae. And what the cervid family is, it's pretty much the deer family. And so I hope everyone knows what an elk looks like. Now, here's a prime example of a really nice male and a female elk. Now, remember what I mentioned early on is that when the Europeans came here, they saw these animals and it was they didn't know exactly what they were because they're a little bit different than the red deer back in Europe, and they gave them this elk name, which is for moose. How they confused an elk with a moose, all I can imagine is they had lots of rum on those ships that they brought over. And so the cool thing with elk, they are the second largest member of the deer family in North America. The moose that you see on the right-hand side is the largest member of this Cervidae deer family. But besides elk and moose, we also have whitetail deer. We also have mule deer. And so these are just some of the related animals that you have in North America to elk that fall in the Cervidae family. Now, most of you, I imagine, especially if you're joining in from the East Coast, which most of you are tonight, you're very familiar with whitetail deer. You've seen males and females of whitetail deer, and we all know that males and females of deer are typically called bucks and does, and the babies are called fawns. That's not so with elk. When you're referring to males and females with elk, we refer to them as bulls or as cows, and then their young, their offspring, are referred to as calves. So it is a little bit different. Some of you on the East Coast may not be used to the terminology, but again, they're not referred to as bucks and does. Elk are referred to as bulls and cows. So if you hear Kim or I or anyone else speaking and we're talking about bulls and cows, we're not talking about the things that make hamburger. Those are bulls and cows. We could be talking about these elk because that's the proper terminology for them. And so as we jump in, let's give you a little bit of information about their physical characteristics. Their weight, these are really big animals. They're much bigger than the whitetail deer that many of you are probably used to. And so whereas a whitetail deer, you get adult deer that will weigh 100 pounds to a very, very large whitetail deer would be pushing 200 pounds. If you look at elk, a female elk, a cow elk, can weigh anywhere from 300 to 600 pounds. Again, there's a lot of variation because they did extend all over North America, so depending on the geographic region they come from, they vary in size. But for the most part, you're going to look at a cow elk weighing anywhere between 300 to 600 pounds, roughly about 500 pounds on average. That bull, as in the case with most species, usually the males are a lot larger than the female, or somewhat larger than the female. But a bull elk can weigh anywhere from 400 pounds to one of the smaller ones, all the way up to 900 pounds. Now, 900 pounds is a huge animal. Usually the largest of the elk in this come from, it's that Roosevelt subspecies, which are Pacific Northwest. They tend to have the biggest body weights. What's interestingly enough is the Rocky Mountain elk tend to have the largest antlers. So like I said, there's lots of variation between elk depending on what geographic region they come from. But again, they're all the same species, but there's just tremendous variability. Now, if you look at that weight range from 400 to 900 pounds, about a 700-pound bull elk is typical. But again, you could get some that are much larger than that. You could get some much smaller than that, and they're still full-grown adults. So obviously, these males and females will produce young elk, which are called calves. And when calves are born, generally you're looking at them dropping a calf that weighs somewhere around that 35-pound weight range. And Kim could talk more. Is that typically what you found with the newborn calves, Kim? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
35 to 40,
they're
yes.
large creatures. And many of you joining in today, you've been on all these bear presentations that I give. Understand that a bear, when that gives birth, a black bear will typically give birth to a cub that's between 8 to 10 ounces. So just over half a pound. And now you have this animal that could be eaten by a bear. It's being born at a weight of 35 pounds at birth. So, moving on, a little bit about their behavior. Like I said, most of you are probably familiar with whitetail deer and understand a lot about that animal, their mating behavior. One of the things that is different, that is unique, and I love for you to experience it, is the mating season for elk. Because what they do vastly different than white-tailed deer is during that fall period, starting usually around early September, all the way through October, is the bulls will begin to collect harems. And what they do is they collect these female cows and they herd them up. And these adults, dominant males, these lead bulls, these head bulls, they'll more or less protect that harem of cows that they have rounded up. And this is where you get a lot of that battling between some of these dominant bulls. Uh, they're literally defending their harems, and they'll watch over these harems for a number of weeks while they're doing the whole mating season and going through that whole process. And that is vastly different than whitetails. But one of the things I want to do, and I will tell you, it is one of the most fascinating and most wonderful thing about these animals is the way they sound. You see these pictures, you know what these elk look like, but the bulls are absolutely unique. And what I want to do, I'm going to play something for you because I want to create this vision for you. And so imagine this guy in the middle of the rut, whether or not it's September or October, and he's really fired up and he's really wanting to maintain his harem, and he gets very loaded with testosterone and will not only be seeking to round up these additional cows, but he also wants to defend his turf. And so any other bull that comes in his area, he wants to make it known that this is his territory, these are his cows. He's not going to stand for any of that. And so what they do is what we call a bugle. And this whole presentation is the return of the bugle. If you have never heard this, it is one of the most wonderful sounds. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to hopefully set the moves. So pretend you're wherever you may be in the Rocky Mountains, even in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, wherever you're likely to encounter these animals. Just picture yourself early in the morning. The mist is still lingering in the field. And you know that these large bulls are out in the field or out nearby. Now just close your eyes and listen to what these things sound like, because it's truly a sound that's indescribable. And hopefully this will come across okay. All right. Well, whenever I hear that sound, I'm telling you, I literally have goosebumps. That elk bugle is one of the most magical, most haunting sounds you could ever hear, especially when they're close by and you hear that. Now, the best way I could describe it, and I don't know if anyone else has a better description, I call it's literally a terrestrial wail. The sounds that they emit, that high-pitched squeal when they're warding off other bulls or calling to their cows. There's a whole series, and it's the most magical sound. Maybe I'm getting too too goofy here, but it's something that if you have never heard it, and if you live on the East Coast, by all means go to Cataloochee, go to North Cumberland, go to somewhere where there's a large population of elk, and sit back, get there in September, October when you find out when these bulls are bugling. And it will truly be a life-changing experience to hear this live and in person. And unfortunately, that just hearing a recording just doesn't create the mood, but it's something that I highly recommend anyone who's interested in these animals hear live and in person at least one time in their life. So with that, that gives you, I'm not going to go into too much biology. We'll be here to answer whatever questions you have. But I will tell you, when it comes to elk, understand that state wildlife agencies and some federal agencies have the responsibility to manage elk. And a lot of people will say, well, why do you need to manage any animal? Well, look what happened when Europeans first came here and we wiped out elk literally across most of its range. And so the reason we have these state and federal agencies to look over that is to make sure that never happens again. And that's the responsibility of myself as a wildlife biologist, Kim, a wildlife biologist, a lot of researchers like Robert Brewer. We have to learn from our mistakes and make sure we don't repeat some of the worst offenses that we had. And so in almost every situation, the wildlife management comes down to the state wildlife agency. Unless, of course, if you're on federal property like the National Park Service, then it's a federal agency. But we're responsible for managing elk to make sure we have enough numbers of them and that their populations aren't being over-harvested or being reduced to a point that they once were. And so one of the things that we're responsible for is trying to come up with a population estimate. Well, how do you do that? It's very difficult. Again, Kim and I were talking earlier that these studies are not very precise when it comes to coming up with exact numbers. But I will tell you, especially out west, most population surveys are conducted doing aerial surveys. Here I am in New Mexico. It's really easy to do population surveys because you fly in a helicopter or you fly in a fixed-wing aircraft. And because it's so wide open in the west and you oftentimes get snowfall, you can count elk much easier. I will tell you that this picture was actually when we were first trying to figure out how to count elk in Tennessee. I actually had the luxury of going up in the helicopter and trying to count elk in Tennessee. And this was actually a picture I took. Look out that window. What do you see below that aircraft? It's just a carpet of forest. You cannot see an animal that is within the forest when you're flying over it. Now, we were able to spot some elk that were in some clearings here and there, but for the most part, we knew that this method was not going to work for us on the East Coast because there's just too many forested areas. And so we had to come up with different methods, and we're still trying to come up with a really good method. But one of the things that we did, we helped perfect this technique, is using these thermal imaging cameras. Obviously, this is during the daytime, but these thermal imaging cameras can see elk even in the middle of the night. And so we developed these population surveys. Now, understand what a blessing it was to do some of the things I did. Obviously, this is a picture of me. This is Steve Bennett, who was one of the lead elk biologists for Tennessee. But we were doing a lot of these population surveys, and we got to ride around all over these elk areas in the back of trucks looking for elk. You talk about the greatest job in the world. We had the greatest job in the world, or I still do, actually. But this is what these elk look like through that thermal imaging equipment. You can see from their body, remember that camera picks up heat, and so anything that's glowing bright, that's the warmest, will be glowing the brightest. And you see the head. Remember, elk have this really dark brown mane that's really thick hair that insulates them, and so it makes their head stand out separate. And this helps us identify an elk versus, say, a whitetail deer. And so this was, again, taken on one of the population surveys that we did. And in the end, what we're trying to come up with is this population estimate. And here's an example of what those population estimates. This is what we would do as a state wildlife biologist who's in charge of managing elk. We're trying to figure out how many we have and how many we're managing for. So again, I was truly blessed to be able to do a lot of this type of work. But one of the other things, besides determining how many elk you have, one of the things that is usually mandated for most wildlife agencies is to restore populations in areas where those animals are no longer there. Now, understand that that doesn't mean that we're going to store every single species. Some species are harder to restore than others. Some are particularly roadblocks when it comes to public perception. I won't get into that, but restoration of elk is something that we took seriously in the eastern states. And so a number of states have started restoring those populations. And so the state of Tennessee, obviously I bring up Tennessee quite a bit because I used to work there, but the state of Tennessee restored elk beginning in the year 2000. And this was a picture, I took this picture of an elk restoration event, and it's one of the most amazing things you ever want to see, to be able to bring animals back and restore them where they've been missing for literally hundreds of years in some cases. You talk about making a difference and really having something that makes you feel good inside. This is one of those things that it becomes one of the proudest moments of your life. And with that, what I'm going to do is we're going to continue this discussion of restoration, but I'm going to turn it over for a little bit to Kim Delozier. Kim was responsible for restoring lots of those elk to Cataloochee and Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which have since dispersed. But I want to turn the microphone over to Kim to talk about some of his experiences working with elk. And I'm going to leave it on this slide here as we turn it over to Kim.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Darrell. I appreciate that. You know, it's a big topic, too, elk restoration in the east, too. If you, matter of fact, that photograph there of that bull, 7x7, which means 7 points on one side, 7 points on the other. That's bull number 67. I remember him. I caught him, darted him with a dart gun, and we put the first radio collar on 67, so you can see what he's turned out to or into today. But anyway, it's really interesting. A lot of people, love to see elk. They're large wild animals too, and they're very, very majestic and a very interesting vocal, as you might have heard. The cows make a mewing sound too, and the bulls, of course, they'll bugle, they'll squeal, they'll basically even bark. Both cows and bulls will actually bark, which is an alarm system very similar to blowing the whitetail deer. It's interesting, a lot of people think we could put elk everywhere where we did before. Of course, our landscape has changed quite a bit in the eastern U.S. too. We can't put elk everywhere. We know that for a fact. We first have to look at, the states have to basically make the decision that they are interested in restoring elk, and several people have to be involved. It takes a lot of money. It takes about $1 million to be able to conduct an elk restoration project. That's $1 million plus. And so it takes a lot of money, a lot of people, a lot of effort, a lot of permissions, a lot of evaluations before we're able to release the first elk out of the trailer, like we saw here previously too. Thinking back, looking at, of course, the first elk that really we think after the extirpation of the eastern elk was in Pennsylvania. I think back in 1913, elk were brought in from Rocky Mountain National Park. I'm sorry, from Yellowstone National Park, and released to Pennsylvania. I think they paid $30 each for those elk. And that program, though, it's been in existence over 100 years. It's done kind of up and down a roller coaster effect, but now they have a pretty thriving population in Pennsylvania. There's probably 12 different locations in the east where we have elk now. All those are the states, other than Ontario, which is in Canada, and province in Canada. And now probably Ontario's population is probably approaching close to 1,000 now. Other states that have elk, Arkansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Missouri, Minnesota, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, Wisconsin, and West Virginia. I've had involvement with several of those states over the past 7 or 8 years working with elk restoration too. A few things you have to have. The state agency has to be very, very supportive. They have to really basically ask if we can restore this species. And once that happens too, we have to have a very desirable and a safe and disease-free source herd to be able to pull them in from. Two of the biggest source herds that we've used has been Elk Island National Park, which is near Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and Land Between the Lakes, which is in western Kentucky, and also the state of Arizona has produced quite a few elk. Several of the states in the western U.S. supplied some animals for the state of Kentucky. Kentucky actually released over 1,500 animals into that southeastern part of Kentucky, which is the coal mining country, and it's just with the mining activity there, it opened that eastern forest up. You start having early successional habitat coming in, which was just great for deer, turkeys, and elk, and things like that. So anyway, they moved in over 1,500 elk there too, and now Kentucky's population now is described as being 12,000 plus animals on the ground. So that's a lot of animals in that area, and probably the population is still slowly continuing to increase. Just give you a kind of an idea on some numbers. Arkansas probably has 700 to 800. Kentucky, I said 12,000 plus. Michigan, 1,400. Missouri, 135. Minnesota, 83. North Carolina, 150 plus. Pennsylvania, right around 1,000. Tennessee, around 400. Virginia, probably right at 200. Wisconsin, probably closer to 300 now. And West Virginia, as of last week, have released 72 animals, 72 adults, 5 calves, and they're probably approaching about 100 animals on the ground too. So anyway, the Kentucky was one of the first. Wisconsin actually was one of the first ones that released elk and back in the 90s. And of course, Kentucky was next. They were a very active program. All this actually occurred just before the CWD, or chronic wasting disease, hit. And when that hit, it slowed down elk restoration in the east very, very significantly because of the concern of moving that disease into a state that was free. So looking at Kentucky, they brought a lot of animals in. That was a big population. Those animals have branched out to different areas too. Some of those animals have gone into West Virginia and into Virginia and into Tennessee. So that population is starting to move out from the core area too. Just thinking right here, fast forward in today, West Virginia is the last state that's involved in elk restoration. Wisconsin is also involved. This past winter, Kentucky supplied elk to the state of Wisconsin, and those animals were moved up to the northern part of the state near Clam Lake. They already had a population there that had been a kind of been a touch and go for several years, but now they're augmenting that population, and now they have a new area to the south of that. I think it's called Black River, where they're starting to restore elk in that area. So this year, Kentucky supplied elk to Wisconsin, and in the state of West Virginia, both Land Between the Lakes, which is in western Kentucky, supplied, I think it was 14 elk, and we had 51 elk, I think, that the state of Arizona actually donated and gave to West Virginia. So West Virginia is still involved with restoration. Wisconsin's still involved. Wisconsin's looking for one more load of elk, basically from Arizona, and that should finish their restoration effort out. States that's really done well, Virginia's herd has done extremely well. They, for these animals to do well, we basically have to give them somewhere to live. We have to give them something to eat, and basically, leave them alone and give them some peace and quiet, and they do relatively well. Not in every case. In the Smokies, we brought in 52 elk back in 2000, 2001, 2002. And these animals came in and they're pretty naive to predators. Of course, the Smokies has a very efficient population of predators, mainly being the black bear and also coyotes and even bobcat in some situations too. But we brought these cows in, and they were pretty naive to predators. And as you might guess, they had their calves out in the field in Cataloochee in different places, and bears started picking them off like candy. So it just about actually stopped the program. Most of the calves that were born were males, which when you're trying to restore a species, a lost species, I hate to tell you guys, but the males are a dime a dozen. The girls is what we want, and that's what we need. And so most everything that was born was males, and actually the bears were eating most of them. So we instituted an effort where we went in and captured every single bear we could catch in the calving area, put a radio collar around its neck, and moved it to the far end or the west end of the Smokies and released it, knowing that that bear probably would come back. But by the time it took for it to come back, that calf would be more mature, would have a lot more energy, and actually could get away from predators. And it worked like a charm. It saved the project, I think, in the Smokies, and so they're doing relatively well today. Now elk have moved out from the Smokies to the Cherokee Indian Reservation, state of North Carolina, U.S. Forest Service, Blue Ridge Parkway, private ground, and also state wildlife areas. So a lot of things are going on in Maggie Valley, North Carolina right now to actually acquire property, do habitat work that hopefully will improve the habitat for these animals outside of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So we're looking at probably between 17,000 and 20,000 elk in the eastern United States. The biggest part of those courses in that south eastern part of Kentucky in the coal mining area, 12,000 plus. The biggest concern right now is that with the coal mining kind of going south right now, a lot of these areas are going to start to grow up. And the more mature the forest, the lower the carrying capacity. And these elk basically and deer and turkeys are not going to do quite as well. So a lot of money is going in actually to habitat work to try to keep these areas open so these animals basically have higher quality food to eat. Daryl, that's kind of a nutshell, just a real cap on the situation with elk restoration in the east. I can go on with more stories if you like, or do you want to start looking at our time right now? Do you want to open this up for questions?
We'll open it up for questions, so y'all can start typing some questions. Kim, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask for you to elaborate on something that's really important. You mentioned chronic wasting disease. If you could talk a little bit more about that, because I know it put the kibosh on a couple of the releases in Tennessee that were scheduled. But if you want to explain more about chronic wasting disease and the fact that we haven't, as far as chronic wasting disease in elk in the eastern part of the United States, I don't believe any elk have been positively identified with CWD, but I'll let you explain more.
Sure. Yeah. CWD. It's basically a disease of the brain. It causes neurologic problems for the animal too. It's kind of a cousin of mad cow disease, cousin of scrapies in sheep, and CWD probably basically in cervids, deer and elk and moose and things like that. So anyway, it's a disease that is a big concern as well. I think if you look at the cousin of that in people, if I can think of the disease, what is it's
Jakob Creutzfeldt disease.
CJD. That's exactly right too. And I think the biggest concern is they're afraid that if that disease gets here or something, it might jump the species line over to people or to their other animals, and that has not happened to our knowledge right now. So the big concern is that as well too. Plus, it's an impact on your whitetail deer population. They have CWD in Wisconsin and several of the northern eastern states as well too. And so the concern for that, we do not have it in Tennessee. We do not have it in North Carolina and several of the southeastern states, but it's moving this way. So hopefully that will not make it down this far.
Okay.
But
I think what we'll do now is we're going to open it up to all the questions. I know a few of you have already typed in some questions, but I'm gonna have Kim answer this first one. But the first one, Shirley asks, what is the general lifespan of elk? And Kim, you worked with elk more closely than I, so I'll let you cover this one.
Well, if you look probably at the textbook, I hadn't looked at it, but most of the time they're going to say, 12 to 15 years. A lot of times they're going to say very similar, like they do in for a black bear. But I remember we've got elk number 15, which is in Cataloochee now, and she's still living. We brought her in as a young animal, and that was back in 2001 or 2002. So you can see she's probably already in the 16, 17-year-old category right now. So it really just depends. I mean, it's a big variation. Most of your mortality is going to be, before they get a year old. That's going to be your highest age class where mortality is going to hit it the hardest. And then once they reach adulthood, then it's going to greatly decrease too. But it's not uncommon, I think, for animals to live 15 years or so. But probably the weak link in that is their teeth. I think once they start to lose the soundness in their teeth too, then they have a harder time to be able to graze, to feed and stuff too, and be able to adequately digest their food. So, but that's just
Okay,
that's just a
I will
general
take the next
statement.
question. Lori asked a really good question. It says, why is the forest growing back a problem for an elk population? Now, I'm going to go back first of all and talk about whitetail deer. And many of us are familiar with whitetail deer. And if you look at the foods that whitetail deer eat, they are classified as browsers. Now, they will eat grasses, they will eat small vegetation, it's called forbs, which are the broadleaf plants. But a big part of a deer's diet is what is called browse. And browse can grow on woody material. It's like the terminal buds, it's that newly formed leaves, even from trees. So deer are constantly nipping the buds and eating browse as they go. And so they can easily survive in a forested situation. Elk, on the other hand, are not classified as browsers. They are classified more as grazers, which means they're more dependent on the grasses, more dependent on those, we call it early successional plant life. So it's that plant life that grows in when forests are cleared. When you have bare dirt, a lot of that stuff that comes up, that lush green stuff that comes up, it's going to be grasses, it's going to be forbs, and the elk depend on those open areas for that food source. And so the reason this is a problem where forests growing up becomes a problem is because it's eliminating a mature forest, believe it or not, does not offer a lot of really good grasses and forbs for these elk to eat. And so, like I said, elk are classified as grazers, so they need those open areas that are producing lots of lush grasses, lots of other lush areas. And so as those open areas get filled in with trees, it's literally removing the food source from the elk. And that's why Kim said that as that area grows up, the carrying capacity goes down. They can't support as much elk because that food is disappearing as those trees begin to occupy those open areas. Wonderful, wonderful question there, Lori.
I might say one thing. You probably can summarize it by saying basically the younger the plant, the more nutritious than it is than older plants. The older a plant gets, it becomes more fiber and less nutrition. So younger the plant, a lot
All right,
better
I'm going to answer
for
a
wildlife.
question really quick from Teresa and then give the next question to Kim. But Teresa asked, what is the gestation of the elk and also the lifespan? Kim answered the lifespan. The gestation, you have to understand, they're doing a lot of that breeding in September or October, and they're dropping their calves in about the month of May or so, early June by that time. So if you do the math, you're looking at about a 7-month gestation period, give or take a few weeks. And so those animals, that's why they're 35, almost 40 pounds when they come out. They have a long gestation period. They're a big animal, so they're dropping these larger calves, as opposed to bears with that delayed implantation, where that fetus is only growing for a month or two before it's being born. But gestation is usually about 7 months or so on an elk. But Kim, I'm going to read this question to you, and Lori poses it. She says, "Is it a problem bringing an elk from one region to another? Are elk territorial like bears? Do they live in well?" Answer that first one. Is it a problem bringing elk from one region to another?
It's really not. They're very adaptive to their habitat. Matter of fact, I remember I brought the guys in from Elk Island National Park, and you have to realize Elk Island. The reason it's called Elk Island National Park is back around the turn of the century, the Canadians thought they were going to decimate all their wildlife populations, so they created these areas these large areas. This was like, I think, 1,700 acres, 1,700 or 17,000, I can't recall, and actually fenced it. So they actually were trying to fence in the native wildlife there too, because they felt like that they were going to kill everything. And guess, everything's frozen up there in the wintertime, so where do they get their water from? Well, they eat snow, basically, to be able to acquire enough water for what they need too. So I remember bringing down two of the biologists from Elk Island National Park, and we went to Cage Cove, went through Cage Cove too, and I said, well, how do you think elk would do here? He said, if I was an elk and I actually moved from Canada down to this area, Cage Cove, I would have thought that I had died and gone to heaven, because the east grasses, the plants are so much more nutritious than they are in the north and also to the west. So grasses that we don't think are very, very nutritious are much more nutritious than a lot of your western grasses. Give you an example. In the east, it may take an acre and a half or 2 acres to be able to be enough land for grazing for a cow, a beef cow. And you might looking at 50 plus acres in some of the western areas too. So our habitat is much more nutritious. It's much more productive for them here. And so bringing an animal from there here, especially moving down here, we probably have more parasites than what they have in the northern areas. But no, there's really no problem moving these animals from that. We do have some movements now. Let's say, for example, if we put an animal in an acclimation pen and you leave it for a couple of months and open the gate up, there's an attraction to that area. There's a strong affinity to that area. But if you do kind of like they did in Kentucky, where you just open the gate up, let them go, then they're going to travel much, much farther than if you acclimate that area, that animals to that particular area. So it just depends on your technique of how you want to release those animals. In the park, I think I've had one elk leave the park. Let me take that back. A couple elk that went over to Tennessee, and I had to go, I think, 3 different times to go actually pick it up and bring it back into Cataloosa. I had another one that left the park, traveled down towards Cashers, North Carolina, almost into South Carolina, and I went and caught her, and brought her back into the herd as well too. But a lot of times they're doing exploratory movements. These animals, it's a new place, a new environment, new smells, new sounds, and basically some of these animals will get out and actually will explore, and many of those then will move back into the core herd there in the Cataloosa area in the park.
The last part of Lori's question: do they live in herds of males and females, or just males and his girls? Depends. Obviously, during the rutting season, they're forming that harem, and those adult bulls that we call them herd bulls will maintain that harem. But throughout the rest of the year, in the wintertime, a lot of times they will group up. Now, I'm speaking out west, and I'll let Kim respond to the east. But out west, it is dominated by these high mountains that get covered with snow, and so the elk have to move down. And there's elk ranges, winter range and summer range, and so a lot of these elk move in the same areas, and you will sometimes see herds. It's amazing. We ran into a herd of over 200 animals just a couple of weeks ago on our forest here. And so it's wonderful to see all these animals together, but the dynamics shift during that rutting period where the males become defensive and territorial and guard their females. But a lot of the time outside of that period, it's dictated by where is the best food, and you'll find a lot of those animals mingling together. And Kim, I don't know if you see something different on the east as far as the commingling outside of the rut.
Yeah, it's all about food. Like I said, here in the western areas too, winter higher elevations too, winter is a big issue for them too. So these animals are going to go wherever they can find food. A lot of times it's down into urban areas and farming areas too, where they can just try to get enough food to survive through the winter. Here in the east, it's not quite that drastic. These animals will move in different areas in the, especially spring and the summer. A lot of times your bulls will actually group up and actually move up to the higher elevations and stay there until the rut actually starts really in late August, September. So typically there in this area in Tennessee, you're going to have animals basically, you're going to have some animals starting to bugle bulls early to mid-September, and then they're going to be hot and heavy from mid-September all the way through to probably mid-October. So, but anyway, you're going to have some earlier, some later, but for the most part, it's around the latter part of September and the first part of October is when they actually do the breed. So most of the time, they're actually might be buddies. The bulls might be buddies throughout the whole year, but when it comes time for the rut, we call it, and the breeding season too, it's kind of every bull for himself, and they're definitely going to fight. We've had 2 or 3 bulls that basically have locked up in the Smokies. Happens a lot, I think, with some of your mature bulls actually fighting and sparring, not sparring, but fighting, and actually get locked up, and one of them actually will die from that as well. So it does happen. It's not like these animals, are big buddies year round. They actually will try to kill each other during
I will
the
address
season.
Kelly, and I want to say special hi to Kelly. Kelly always joins us from California, so she's one of my Western followers. That the time of these webinars is not always great for Western folks, but thanks for joining in, Kelly. And you mentioned about not ever seeing an elk in California. The good thing is there's lots and lots of elk in California, and you do have some of those Thule elk, which are specific to California. But what you find whenever you're even in the western states, whenever you're looking at the range map, when you see where the populations exist now, you see a lot of these animals remaining in the mountains. And that's indicative, not what makes the best habitat, because if you look at that North American, the historic range, these elk were in the plains, these elk were everywhere. But a lot of a lot of animals, when Europeans started wiping out animals, they sought refuge in the places where humans couldn't get to easily. Guess where that was? That was the mountains. That's where they had a foothold to survive. And so bears, same way. You had bears in the Appalachians that hung on in those areas. Same with the Rocky Mountains. So a lot of these animals that we really put a hurt on when it comes to wiping them out, fortunately we weren't able to wipe them out, all of them out, but literally where you find them in many states are those more rugged areas. That's where they kept that foothold. Now I can't tell you, I'm not very knowledgeable with all the mountain ranges in California. But I tell you what, Kelly, you ever venture over towards New Mexico, Colorado, I can point you exactly to where you can see elk almost every time you go there. And so, really good question. I wish I could tell you where to go in California to see them. But besides seeing them, like I said, I strongly recommend if you get a chance and you want to see them, try to go in that September time frame when they're bugling, because it is truly a magical sound that you hear. It's unlike anything else you'll ever hear in the forest.
Daryl, I see a question here from Shirley about why are the elk not yet in Cage Cove. Well, actually that was that area actually rated the highest of where we should restore elk into the park too, but because of the number of visitors, of course, the Smokies had over 11 million visitors last year, which is extremely dense people. And I think in Cage Cove alone, they have over 2 million people every single year. So there's so many people go there too, and if we put elk there too, it would just be a disaster because it would shut the entire area down because so many people would want to try to go look at the elk. Just in Cataloochee alone, which is in the eastern part of the park, and it's a pretty remote area. It's a tough area to kind of drive into with the kind of a curvy, windy gravel road to get in there too. After we released elk, the visitation increased 5 times to what it was prior to elk being on the ground too. So it was a big concern for the park. We have so many people there too, and we just didn't feel like we could manage more than 2 million people in Cage Cove area. So, they may get there, and if they actually move there on their own, the park will leave them there. I saw a comment earlier from Robert Brewer about saw one cross the road. We actually had 2 or 3 bulls that we felt like came from the North Carolina side over near Cherokee, North Carolina, went over the mountain and went through Cleveland's Dome area, and that are now down about halfway down the mountain down towards Gatlinburg too. So I got a call from the biologist in the park. And he told me that there were three bulls up near Cleveland's Dome. He said, "Do you think you can see Cage Cove from Cleveland's Dome?" I said, "No, you may not be able to see it, but I bet they can smell it." So who knows? Sooner or later, we may have elk in Cage Cove.
Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, because I talked about this issue quite a bit over the last few weeks. Once that video of the elk coming over Newfound Gap, but with your experience in Cataloochee and how difficult it was for the females to protect their calves from the bears, what I told a number of people, even if a couple of females initially find their way to Cades Cove, it may be a long time before they're able to successfully raise a calf, simply because the bear density in the cove is just crazy high, and you're not going to be able to dart move all the bears from the cove. So it may be a long time. I'm sure it's going to happen over time, but it may be a while before you start getting reproduction in the cove itself.
Yeah, it depends on the status of that. If a couple cows move there, like you'd mentioned, if they're already bred, whenever they get there, they possibly could. But these cows are a lot more defensive than what they were, let's say, 15 years ago.
Really
So
good.
now, if a cow has a calf, you better believe there's going to be a battle. We actually have some cows that actually left the main herd. They will go to more remote areas, and then they have their calf. And if they lose it to predator, those cows will come back to the main herd with or without a calf. But you can see actually battle marks and scars and stuff on their rib cage where they actually have been swatted by a bear, assumed a bear, in battle. So no, now these mothers are very protective. They're very defensive, and they're doing a much better job in protecting their calves from predators.
Okay, I'm going to jump back and answer a question really quickly from Shirley about elk coming from Arizona, whether or not they're quarantined. Yeah, any of the movements that take place from state to state, usually there's very strict protocols about disease testing, and anytime they could do disease testing, they'll definitely do whatever they can to ensure those animals that they're moving are healthy. And those Flagstaff herds are really healthy. I love Flagstaff, Arizona, by the way. It's the fifth snowiest city in North America, and it's in Arizona. Anyway, yeah, usually there's very strict protocols on disease testing whenever you move animals. Okay, Lori asked a question. I think this is really good. She says, "I know you said they're dependent on grasses, but are they opportunistic eaters? If grass isn't available, will they get into trash or bird feeders?" Well, here's what's going on, Lori. The reason they won't do that is these animals are what you called ruminants, and it means they have a very specific digestive system. They, believe it or not, they have 4 stomachs, and so there's only certain kinds of foods that these animals are able to digest, and obviously, as they evolved, their stomachs evolved to only digest certain kinds of materials. And so I'm not going to go into the specifics about how it moves through each chamber of the stomach, but these animals are only designed to digest this certain kinds of vegetable matter. So it's geared towards those grasses or those broadleaf plants, and they have a much better job digesting that. And so the elk suddenly aren't able to switch their diet and eat birdseed or eat, for example, browse and eat some of these twigs because their bodies are not designed to digest that kind of material. Don't get me wrong, they'll eat it and it will pass through, but the problem is it won't absorb the nutrients out of those materials. So they're really, really dependent upon these grasses and these forbs for them to eat, because that's how their bodies are designed. They can't just switch and eat anything they want. They won't get the nutrition from it.
Daryl, I might add one thing right here on the diet too. We kind of classify deer as being specialists. They kind of go after more specialized foods, and elk tend to be more generalist in what they eat. But I would say this, that there's one thing that we had some issues with. Apparently, a lot of these animals in the mountains are salt deficient. And I think many years ago, when you had more open areas, you may have had more salt licks, natural salt licks in the mountains. And now, apparently, when these areas grow up, those are not available. And so these animals were salt deficient. So we had actually people actually putting out potato chips, and these animals were coming over to eat potato chips along roadways, really to get the salt out of it. The wintertime, these visitors would come in and their cars would be coated with salt from the roadways, from de-icing, and these animals will come up and actually would be licking the vehicle clean, actually, of all the salt off of the vehicles that actually came from the roadways, trying to make sure that those roads didn't freeze up. So anyway, salt's a big issue of that as well too. And so if they come over and try to get food, a lot of times they're trying to get the salt from from whatever food they may have.
Okay, I'm gonna.
I recall one guy. Someone sent me one guy actually sent me a picture of this gentleman who was bald headed and an elk who was very food conditioned. To people actually had stuck her head inside this visitor's vehicle and was licking the top of this bald man's head, and I'm assuming to get salt off of his head.
I have not heard that. All right, I'm going to respond to a comment by Kelly. She says, we talked about bear weights. We did that at the last webinar. These animals are similar in size to big black bears and medium-sized grizzlies. She had no idea. I'll tell you what, Kelly, when you're talking about these adult bull elk, I'd say they're much larger than black bears. A large black bear, even a male, you get a 400, you sometimes get a 500-pound male, which is really, really big. They can get bigger, but under different circumstances. So you're looking at a huge, huge black bear being 400 pounds, maybe 500 pounds. These bull elk can easily get up over 700 pounds. So I'd say these are much larger than black bears. Now, brown bears, on the other hand, they definitely get larger than black bears. Now, brown bears will feed on elk. They generally don't actively hunt elk. They will obviously kill a calf or go after a calf that they find. But a lot depends on whether or not that bear is stressed and it's needing the food. But an adult bull elk is a very formidable opponent to any bear because that thing's a huge animal. You're talking an animal that 600, 700 pounds, it's definitely going to put up a fight.
Daryl, I might say one thing on the weight. When we brought elk in from Elk Island National Park or Land Between the Lakes, generally what you had mentioned, the cows weigh between 400 and 600, and the bulls weigh between 500 and 700 pounds. But I might add that these animals probably have increased in size since they got here because the food is probably better. And we actually had one bull that was killed by a vehicle over in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, and they actually took that animal and weighed the animal, and it weighed 998 pounds.
Incredible.
So that, of course, we don't weigh those. Of course, it's kind of hard to weigh an animal that's that big. So, but this is one they actually weighed. It weighed 998
Absolutely.
pounds.
They could get huge in size. And you bring up a good point, Kim, because whenever you restore an animal to a new area, and I'm talking back in the early 2000s, when we first brought in elk and released them, folks have to understand that those elk, they don't know where to go. They don't know where to find the food. And usually those first couple of years, all the way up to 10 years, those animals are just barely hanging on because they're learning how to survive in this new area and develop these feeding patterns. But once they become established, it takes a number of years, but once they become established, you will see their health increase. You'll see their weights increase because they know where to go when this field is no longer productive. They know they could find food elsewhere. But usually those first couple of years are really, really hard, and those elk are barely hanging on. But like you said, once they become established, they then performing to their fullest potential. Okay, Shirley's going to really test my knowledge. The Thule Elk being the smallest subspecies, I am fairly certain you are correct. I do know that the Roosevelt Elk tend to have the highest body weights, but it's kind of weird because the Roosevelt Elk are just north of where the Thule Elk are, but the Thule do seem to be the smallest of those subspecies. Now remember, an elk is an elk is an elk, so you could bring a Thule and move it around. They're all the same species, but because of where they're located, they do have this difference in size. and why the Thule are smaller in that area, a lot could have to do with the food sources in that area. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that true western coast. Maybe we should get Kelly to answer this question, but um, a lot of the variation definitely stems from the foods that are available in that area.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Probably poor nutrition is probably going to attribute why the Thule elk is probably one of the smallest. And I think those sizes, typically you can read they'll go up to about 550 pounds. So they are somewhat smaller than your other subspecies.
Okay, what I'm going to do real quick, since we're still answering questions, if anyone has any other questions, I'm going to show a couple more slides. I got to end this and wrap this up for the recording. But obviously, I wanted to thank everyone for participating in this. This was our very first adventure into the world of elk. Hopefully, it won't be the last. Um, Again, we'll still answer a few questions. I do absolutely, absolutely have to give the greatest props to Bob Howdeshell. He's the wildlife photographer that supplied almost every single one of these elk pictures. He's based out of Maryville, Tennessee. Fantastic photographer, wonderful, wonderful gentleman. He's the one that truly provided these pictures for this presentation. Obviously, everyone knows you can go to Wildlife for You to find out whatever courses are coming up. You can register for the courses through there. Easiest way to follow us on Facebook. We'll let you know what classes are coming up. Having said that, mark your calendars because I've got two that are on the docket. Many of you are already registered for Neighborhood Critters. I don't know if Robert is still with us on the presentation, but that's Robert Brewer. He's a wildlife professor out of Cleveland State Community College, born and raised East Tennessean, so he's got some of the same blood lineages as Kim. But his talk is next Thursday at 7 p.m. to talk about neighborhood critters. And then one that I'm really excited about and really looking forward to it is we had an unfortunate incident a number of weeks with a cougar in the state of Washington. And there's been a lot of concern about hiking in cougar country. And so we designed a safety class that is literally going to talk about cougars and cougar behavior and what do you do in case of an encounter. We've got a couple of other instructors, Dr. Sean Murphy, he was a large carnivore specialist. He was doing research on cougars here in New Mexico for a while. I believe he's back in Kentucky now. I gotta call Sean. And then Stephanie Dennis, who coordinates a lot of this wildlife human incident training between federal and state agencies. She could respond to questions regarding what to do in case of an encounter. She coordinates a lot of that stuff. But by all means, look those up and join us on that one. And so I'm going to leave it on this slide. We appreciate you joining in on these wildlife webinar talks, and I'll stick around as long as anyone wants. But again, we thank you for being interested in wildlife, and that's why we're here. We love teaching you guys, and we hope you stick with us as we give more and more of these webinars. But with that, I'm gonna shut off the recording, and I will stick around and answer any last questions anyone might have.